and Tobias
Yeah.
Ryan. And you're in conversation with, you
With
will
me?
introduce him.
Oh yeah,
Yes.
well I can, yes.
Okay, a round of applause.
Thank you.
Okay. Well, okay. We're here so to talk to Benjamin about his book, The Third Solitude, a Memoir Against History. A book that was called A Frank Love Letter to Modern Jewish Life by Memoir, the critic, and was described by Lisa Robinson as reconstructing the story of his family's flight from the European Holocaust to Montreal, alongside an account of the Anglo-French settler colonialism of Quebec. Libman, she goes on, composes a concentric series of subtle queries on the collective synthesis of memory, the political uses of nostalgia, and the personal experience of critical distancing within the family milieu, bringing the reader to a poetics of history whose moment is the future. So I thought we would start with a kind of the more personal side, and perhaps give everyone a bit of a introduction to the family story that you were engaged with trying to tell.
Yeah, so first of all, thank you all for showing up. This is really an incredible thing for me to see, having moved here 3 years ago, just to be able to see some faces in a crowd for a book one has written is a big delight. So yeah, this is, well, the story that's kind of at the heart of, or in the background of this book is one, there are a few of them, but the main one mostly happened to my paternal grandmother and her parents. So my maternal grandmother was born in Vienna, and at about 4 years old, the Nazis occupied Austria. The Anschluss happened in 1938, and her parents decided to take her, as well as her sister, to Canada as refugees, basically from this problem that they saw pretty clearly, I mean, certainly in hindsight. And the rest of the family decided to stay. They thought that it, to varying degrees among them, that it was a bit of an overreaction to abandon one's life and go. And I guess the story is kind of, it tells itself from there. Most of those people who stayed didn't end up surviving. And part of the book begins as a photo essay. It's hard to see, obviously, from back there, but this is sort of the first photo that begins the first chapter of the book. And in it is a train, and in the window of the train you see my grandmother and her sister and their two parents, and on the platform is the rest of the family. And most of the people on that platform don't survive the war. My grandmother, whose name is Eva, and her mother, Anna, are kind of central figures in this book, in large part because a few years ago, actually over a decade ago, I came into the possession of a lot of photographs and letters and other kinds of documents that had belonged to Anna, my great-grandmother, and they attest to a life of someone who has, left an old world for a new one, in many more ways than one, and who, after she arrived, was involved in building and developing a community, the Jewish community of Montreal, which is itself quite heterogeneous, but which she and her husband were very involved in building, and which ultimately made me. I mean, it produced not only myself and the kind of the mind that has had to grapple with a lot of the things that particular community has decided to teach as valuable and important, but also all the people I grew up with, many of whom feature in one way or another in this book. So that's kind of the main story, the main background to the text, but it kind of ventures pretty far afield in many different directions.
Yeah, and as it goes on, like the place of Montreal, and specifically Montreal community, is I think it's more and more important, more developed. And that's a good excuse to ask you about the title of it,
Yeah.
which I think is a phrase which is very well known in Montreal, but maybe people here won't perhaps be aware.
Yeah, it's well known in Montreal and in Canada, especially among people in my parents' generation and above. And I know of, I guess, at least two Canadians in this room, Penelope and Lisa, who will certainly be familiar with the Two Solitudes. this is a novel, Two Solitudes, a novel written by Canadian novelist Hugh MacLennan, right around the end of the Second World War. And it's a kind of typical Bildungsroman about a young man who is trying to navigate this society that is deeply divided along linguistic and religious lines, and other sorts of ideological lines too that come with those. So probably everyone here is familiar with the idea, at least, that Canada, and in Quebec in particular, is divided between, on the one hand, English-speaking Protestants and French-speaking Catholics, to put it quite productively. And Hugh MacLennan was trying to discover at this point in time when Canadians were just beginning to kind of, move out of the metaphorical basement of the United Kingdom and become their own country. They had only recently been given the ability to determine their own foreign policy, for example, when it came to joining the Second World War. And he wanted to know what it meant to be Canadian at a time when these two visions of what Canada could be, the Franco-Catholic and the Anglo-Protestant, were quite at odds with one another. Most of a huge part of the French-Canadian contingent at that time was resistant to conscription into the Second World War, just as they had been into the First World War. They didn't want to fight for a monarch who was the head of Great Britain. So this book, I guess, was his attempt to synthesize these two political energies and to discover what, if anything, one could call a kind of common Canadian substrate. And after that book came out, there were not a few Canadian writers who quipped that there might be a third solitude, in particular Irving Layton and A.M. Klein, who were two well-known Canadian Jewish poets, both of whom had been affiliated with McGill, and both of whom had kind of, in their own ways, made this remark that the Jews of Montreal in particular, but the Jews of Canada, maybe more broadly construed, were this third solitude. That is to say that there was another constitutive demographic element in the country, even though it was, punching above its weight or something like that, that should be considered. And what I wanted to do in this book, in part, is really the subject of the fifth and final chapter, is to explore just what that might mean, and explore whether the concept of the solitudes don't actually adhere to specific peoples at all, but are actually more of a structural requirement of the fabric of Canadian society as it currently exists. And so this is something that I get into toward the end, thinking about how a lot of the Jews who had come to Canada came quite poor. They took up trades. They were generally working class or lower middle class, although that wasn't the absolute rule. And over time, they became, what we would call a quote-unquote model minority. But in so doing, one of the things I try to highlight is that they abandoned a lot of the solidarity that had characterized their political and other affective engagements as a community for many decades. And
Are you okay?
this is good. I'm glad we have another intervention here.
Sorry. A very suspiciously.
No one, don't sit at the very end. It's going to tip over. This already happened.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
That's dangerous weather.
Okay,
Did you want rescue from the corner?
I'm gonna bounce the mask.
Cool. No, I'm glad. This is great. So anyhow, yeah, thinking about how this community abandoned a lot of the political principles that I think had made it into a community in the first place, and also enabled it ultimately to become this kind of what I consider to be an ideologically enclosed community around Zionism today, and that's what I grew up with. So this is partly what the Third Solitude is meant to interrogate.
Okay, yeah. So we've just been talking about the origins of the title of the book. Ben's given a brief introduction to the story it's going to tell. I think we're going to have a bit of a reading in a moment. But before we do, I wanted to ask you. Okay, so you grew up in Montreal. You grew up knowing this family history, more or less the way families tell their stories.
Yeah.
So what was the moment where you decided that this was something that was going to become a writing project, and then a book subsequent to that?
Yeah, so all those documents and letters, photographs, and stuff that I mentioned a moment ago, that a lot of which made their way into the book, these are things I came into possession of more or less all at once. I mean, my father and my uncle and a few other people in my family are sort of, every family has their genealogists and historians, and they've done the work of keeping a bit of an archive. But about 12 years ago, I discovered that we had estranged family in Austria, living in Vienna. And my father was the only person who had met someone from that side of the family in decades. And I decided I wanted to meet them, and I was going on a kind of classic summer in Europe when I was 18. And I reached out to the sister of the person my father had met. Her name in the book is Marta, actually. I changed her name to preserve her privacy. And when I was staying with Marta, who was very kind to me as a host, at some point after showing me around, she told me that she wanted me to meet someone, to meet her mother. So her mother, who this would be my grandmother's generation, she was the niece of my, so it's getting kind of complicated, actually. Maybe I'll leave that part out. The mother, anyway, had a lot of these documents, and the reason she had them was that her own mother had been a hoarder. So this really kind of goes back generation upon generation. So her own mother had been a hoarder. She never threw anything out, and that's because her husband, this guy Max, had been killed. He was actually captured. He tried to escape into Spain, and he was captured in France. And the SNCF, the same SNCF that runs trains all over France today, deported him to Majdanek. And he actually never arrived there, which means he probably died on the train. But this was her husband, and she felt that she wanted to, I guess, answer this, the question of what this tragedy could mean, how it could possibly have happened, the kind of question that got asked a lot. And so she kept all of the letters that my great-grandmother had written to Max. That was her brother. She kept a lot of administrative documents, a lot of photographs, I said. And I got given all these things in like one big pile. And she was like, here, this is Inga, the mother of the person I was staying with. She said, here, these aren't mine. These belong to you. These belong to your family. Do with them what you will. And I think probably a lot of people here have had an experience receiving or coming across this kind of document pertaining to their family's history and having the feeling of like, well, I must do something with this. And I think this is kind of the experience that kicked off the book, was a sense of responsibility. Somehow this residue of a life testified to the fact that there was still a flame to be kept alive, but at the same time, you're filled with the anxiety that whatever you choose to do with these documents won't be adequate to the life that produced them. And this was something that kind of plagued me for a while. I felt I wanted to do something, but I was crippled by the fact of not really knowing what could be done or what would be appropriate. And when I started graduate school, I took a course on memorializing the Second World War. And it was taught by this great art historian, Alexander Nemerov, who at least someone in this audience has encountered before. And he encouraged us for our kind of final assignments in this graduate school course to get as personal as we would like and to be as creative as we'd like with whatever was supposed to be our testament to what we had thought about over the course of those few weeks. And in a way, I kind of just needed this authorization from someone who's completely unrelated to or completely unattached to what I had been grappling with for a few years, to say, just begin. And so if I can pass anything on, I would just say, there is no good beginning to a project like that. You just have to begin. And once you do that, you'll probably, the rest will find its own path, as it were. So that's how the book began. And I ended up turning that paper into an essay that an editor at Dundurn saw, and she wanted to turn it into a book, so here we are.
All right. And now you're going to read from that very book.
Right. So, it's good I went into all that mess of family tree relations, because this bit takes place when I'm at the apartment of Ilsa, who's the mother of Marta, who gives me the documents. And yeah, I'm on her balcony, and this is the moment when I received them. From the balcony, we could see a ways into town. Ilse served us tea or coffee and bid us wait as she disappeared into the darkened living room. I have tried so many times to accurately remember the rather banal scene that then followed. But for some reason, that moment, standing there with Marta on her mother's balcony, overlooking Vienna, remains partly occluded in my mind. The essentials I recall: Ilse returned in a shuffle, holding a stack of papers and white and beige folders, old folders torn here and there at the corners, which she then handed to me. But why do I recall an old man watching us from behind a window? Was Ilse's husband not present as well, albeit at a distance? I never shook his hand, but was he not somewhere in the sitting room watching this exchange of documents? Or had he already died some years before? I remember only Marta translating for me what her mother said, as she watched me flip through the papers now in my lap. They had belonged to Risa, Ilse's aunt. Most were letters from Anna to Risa, and to her brother, Max, Risa's husband, many of which were posted in 1943, when it would have been too late for him to receive them. While attempting to escape the Nazis by fleeing to Spain via France, he was captured by French police. The official Acte de Disparition, a sort of death certificate issued by the French government in 1947, summarizes his fate succinctly. Interned on the 26th of February 1943 at Cours. Transferred on the 2nd of March 1943 to Drancy. Deported on the 4th of March 1943 in the direction of Lublin Majdanek, Poland. The somewhat ambiguous "in the direction of" is not a product of bureaucratic vagueness. It represents an actual uncertainty, as far as official documentation goes, as to where and when Max died. Had he arrived at Majdanek, he would have had at best about a 25% chance of leaving the camp alive. His name would also have been recorded among the arrivals in the meticulous train records kept by the Nazi camp administrators. But as far as the French Ministry of Veterans and War Victims could tell, Max was never recorded as having arrived at the camp where, today, one can stand before a mountain of human ashes heaped inside a concrete, open-air monument to the dead. Another way to put this is that he almost certainly died while on a train operated by the same national rail service that operates trains all over France to this day. His corpse may even have been dumped overboard or left to some unwitting attendees at one of the many rural train stations between France and Poland. In any case, his remains will never be found. The photograph below, it's hard to see, but used presumably for some sort of identity card or document, was among 4 or 5 similar headshots included in the pile Ilse gave me. My father and uncle also have copies of this same headshot, indicating that he had ordered several prints of it, or else that they were printed multiple times on a single sheet of photographic paper before being cut out one by one. There were also postcards, newspaper clippings, and dozens of legal and administrative pages dating back to the 19th century. Most bore text or lettering in German, though many others were in Polish, Russian, French, and other languages I couldn't identify. It was known in my family that Risa had been a hoarder, and it was evident that the stack I now held in my hands had been collated not by Ilse herself, but by her aunt, and was only left to the former for safekeeping or as part of the legacy in Risa's will. I sifted carefully, using the opportunity of being with 2 Germanophones to identify the nature of as many of the items now in my possession as possible. Though it was clear to me from the start that these documents were now mine, or more accurately, my family's, for some reason I protested that I couldn't accept such a significant gift. In fact, I had known beforehand that something like this would happen. Marta had told me the night before that her mother wanted to give me something. This accounted for my nervousness in the car on the way over, and presently accounted for my illogical unwillingness to accept this offering. It was as if I were being given a responsibility I did not want, because I did not know what to do with it. Was I supposed to have everything translated? Or maybe I was meant to scan and preserve it all for posterity. Ilse suggested that I donate some of the more interesting papers to the Jewish Museum of Vienna. Risa already did this once, she told me, but she always said she probably missed something. I considered that document hoarders, being squirrely with information but lacking the assiduousness of record keepers, always knew that they had, without necessarily knowing what they had. I could well imagine Risa's erstwhile certainty that she had, quote, probably missed something, even as she could not have pinpointed what that something was. Every family has its amateur historians and genealogists. My father is one, as I said. Eva's my grandmother. Eva's nephew, Eric, is another. And by all accounts, Risa was one. Perhaps the first, having found herself in the peculiar position of one who felt the catastrophes of the Holocaust, while being untargeted by them herself on account of her Christian faith and Austrian ethnicity. Her husband was taken from her by her own leaders, who thought her the ideal of purity. And that man, Max, had disappeared in the worst way imaginable, vanished in a question mark, in the space between one railway station and another, in the black ink of the words, in the direction of. How could she have ended up as anything other than a hoarder, a searcher, a detective chasing a mystery long ago solved? All she wanted was to fix this ambiguity to a definite spot, a fact. I think Risa hoarded in the hope that somehow, someday, one of those errant clippings or carbon copies was going to prove itself to be the missing piece of her life's puzzle. She wanted control. My father had told me that she chose to die by assisted suicide. She traveled to Switzerland for it. Maybe this was why, a matter of control. I left Ilsa's with the certainty that she was happy. For once, something she had been holding on to had lived up to its reason for being preserved. This was a parcel whose transit had not been spatial but temporal, and to her mind it had now arrived at its destination. She was rid of it, and now I was burdened. Sitting in the passenger seat as Marta pulled out of the driveway and rolled us toward home, I fretted at the weight now pressing upon my lap, trying with both hands to keep its sheets and slips from being jostled out of order and onto the car floor. That evening I was treated to another of Ilsa's gifts. She had asked Marta to give me one of her season tickets to a loge in the Wiener Staatsoper. It was my first time seeing the magic flute. Not having brought any nice clothes, I attended in jeans and a short-sleeved shirt with buttons. I was transported by exhaustion into a reverie, paying little attention to the performance unfolding before me. But the essentials made it through. I wished that such a flute could be granted to me, a guide, an aid, a talisman to bring me through the trials of my life, where I felt lost and unready to bear the weight of duty. But it was an empty thought. The next morning, having bid Marta farewell, I heard the ringing of the previous night's music finally leave my mind's ear. I could feel myself emptying out as I walked toward the central train station, bound for Paris. I was reducing all my thoughts, seeking what, if anything, remained. And there, irreducible, was the load now added to my back, the legacy of which I was now, supposedly, the custodian. I had only the one thought left: what to do. Actually, this is not true. I had one other thought, which lingered in spite of all. It was the memory of something Ilsa had said to me right before we left her apartment. It was a correction. She told me that Risa hadn't traveled to Switzerland to be euthanized. She had been unable to travel. No, she had hired some men to steal into her apartment in the middle of the night and kill her. She was found the following morning with a plastic bag over her head. Or so I was told.
There's a couple of things I want to pick up from that, but we'll start with just a kind of general one. I know you as much as a fiction writer, as a memoirist or a critic. Just in terms of process, like what was the approach different going into writing a family history or a history compared to how you approach writing fiction?
That's such a good question. It was very different. I mean, I think so writing about the past, I mean, doing any form of history, of which memoir is just one genre, obviously is a kind of fictive enterprise. And I think we're more accepting of that now than maybe people were 100 years ago. But you need to determine that, A, these things that kind of litter the landscape of the past, events and objects and other sorts of things, are themselves something like a transcendent fact. You know, this sort of string of facts, or transcendent truth maybe is a better way to put it, that your history needs to be adequate to, needs to kind of raise from the dust of time and bring before the reader. That itself, of course, is open to question. You know, just how, just what is the difference between an event and the context in which an event happened, or just how much of a fact your understanding of a person actually is. But on top of this, you have to make a historiographical choice. You have to choose, you know, the way Hayden White puts it in meta-history, you know, you have to choose what form of implotment you want to employ. Or if you don't choose, then it will probably be chosen for you by your subconscious. But is your history romantic? Is it tragic? Is it rationalistic or positivistic? And all of these elements, I guess, are familiar to me from the act of writing fiction. But what is interestingly different, I guess, is the kind of obstacles you face. Like writing fiction, I think typically my main obstacle is a typical writer's block. I feel that I don't know where to begin, or I don't know how to proceed. And once I figure it out, it's like, I don't know if you've ever seen these videos of a block of wood placed between two electrodes, and the current produces a kind of tree-like structure that gets burned into the block as it passes through. And what's happening is that the current is kind of seeking passivities in a material that presents mostly resistance to it. It's seeking kind of the path of least resistance, and that's the structure it ends up producing. Writing fiction typically feels a bit like this to me. Like once I've discovered the material, the subject matter, then if I can plug in, so to speak, the invention will proceed according to the various paths of least resistance for that cycle of invention. But in this case, the obstacle was my own mind. It was my own memory. And I think I discovered just how poor my memory is. And I hope just how poor all of our memories are, not just mine, but it definitely was a shock to me to realize that you know, you can feel certain about something, but once you're telling yourself that this has to now go down in writing, and that people will read it, and some of those people actually have memories of the same thing you have, you become much less certain that what you've remembered is true, and that becomes the main obstacle to writing.
I guess, I mean, it's kind of just a bit of an extension of that point, but there's, at one point you say this. When it comes to the narrated past, to history, in other words, my mind has few qualms about converting the plausible into the actual. What did it really matter if things were actually one way or another? Every story of the past, even the most fastidious, is already an arrangement of types. The thing that happened is superseded by the kind of things that would happen. So you've mentioned a couple of times in your excerpt and just in the conversation, firstly, like this sense of responsibility, of being up to the task of what had been put in front of you. And then reading that, I was curious if you felt a responsibility to get things right in a way.
Yeah.
And then there's a question of, you know, by what metrics? Is it get it right as the representative of your family, of your community? There's also getting it right in terms of being a good writer and, you know, producing an interesting, engaging, propulsive book. So yeah, what was how did you relate to that tension of getting it right, if it existed?
Yeah. Well, I guess to take each of those kinds of getting it right separately, because I think they're interesting in themselves. The family bit was vexing because frankly, there were people in my family and also friends, people who I'd grown up with, who were either upset about the writing of this book, because I come from a very Zionist environment, and this is a very, frankly, anti-Zionist exploration of this world that made me and the things that made it. So there's a lot at stake in getting it right. As a matter of getting the people who are described right, getting the place that's described right. But something that I realized over time is that getting it right itself is kind of, it's a bit of a red herring, or I think we focus on the wrong thing. And I've evolved on this over the course of writing this book. But, you know, when I first had those documents and I first thought of doing something with them, I was like, I'm going to write a novel. And actually, I wrote a novel, and it's really terrible, and it's never going to see the light of day. I hope, unless someone kills me and fishes out of my hard drive. Yeah, that's a novel. But in writing that, I spoke to a lot of members of my family, trying to get stories from them about members of my family, some of whom appear in this book, to try to turn into fiction, one way or another. And I discovered that there were a lot of incongruities. But it wasn't that one person's version was probably the right one and the other's was the wrong one. What I realized was that the thing that they were getting right, the thing that they were focusing on, was not the person, but the relationship they had with the person. And this, in fact, is actually all that people know of other people. I don't really think anymore that it's possible to know another person. You can only know the relationship you have with them. I think people are basically black holes into which all light disappears. Great. I never said it was a cheerful book. But this was liberating in a way, because I realized that what mattered most was getting my relationship to, for example, Anna, my great-grandmother, and her, it's her materials in this book, getting my relationship to her right. And what's interesting about that is that I didn't have an actual relationship with her. I never knew her, I never met her. But another thing I realized is that that's not exactly how relationships work. They're not restricted to physical one-on-one contact with people. I could tell you a story about my great-grandmother, and you would have a relationship to her, and that relationship would consist of the story I've told you, and also the fact that it was me who told you that story. And I think biographers, for example, experience this a lot, especially when their subjects are no longer living. They become intimately acquainted with their subject through documentary traces and hearsay accounts. But their big mistake, if they make it, is to believe that what they've come to know so intimately is the person. I think what they've come to know is their extremely deep, extremely variegated, extremely evidenced relationship with that person. But those are two different things still. And this liberated me to feel that I just needed to get my relationship to Anna right and understand that this kind of phantom I was constructing out of these photographs and these letters and these documents, and also the stories I was being told by my family, that's what I needed to convey, rather than the flesh and blood person of whom the phantom is derived.
Okay. Just before the sentence I read, there's a moment where you adopt the first person I, relating a story that was a story from your father. It's a dream. You dreamt this story that your father had experienced, and as you're describing it, you say, okay, so I did this. By I mean my father. And I was wondering if there was ever a tension, were you frequently fighting this desire to put yourself, to fictionalize essentially?
Well, I'm glad you asked that, because that I forgot about the second strand of your previous question. But this is exactly on that. This is the getting it right in the sense of what you want to do as a writer. And insofar as I knew I was doing a work of nonfiction, actually this wasn't a memoir until, this was like a publisher decision to call it a memoir. I can talk about that. I don't feel negatively about that, but I feel ambivalent about it. But I knew I was writing nonfiction, and I knew that implied certain generic conventions that were useful and that didn't need to be done away with. But I am, as a writer, I'm kind of unruly as a rule, I would say. And there were certain moments when I really wanted to break with the generic conventions, say, of sticking to the sort of the transcendent, quote-unquote, truth of what happened, to convey something else, precisely because I thought the convention not only interfered with, but actually was destructive to what I was trying to convey and how I wanted to convey. So in this example, this is like the night I arrive in Vienna, and I had a crazy dream that night when I was staying my first night at Marta's house, and I remember it to this day. That's why it ends up in this book. It's very memorable to me. And in this dream, I am my father, but him as a younger man, like more around my age then, maybe 21, 22. And he had this experience where he was on a bike trip through France, and it was raining, and he tried to post up for the night at this farmstead, and a farmer let him stay in a barn. And while he was in a barn, a different man tried and was successful in breaking into the barn and tried to assault him. And the farmer basically saved him and got this guy to go away. but for some reason I had this dream as if I were him. And if I were following the convention of a traditional nonfiction book, I would write it as a kind of reported event. I would say, I had a dream, and in the dream, I myself was, it was how I just told it to you. And I would keep the distance clear so that who I am and who I am not is retained as a kind of a law of that form of writing. But this would not have conveyed what I wanted to convey. What I wanted to convey was not the fact that I had a dream. What I wanted to convey was the absolutely baffling and shocking experience of having such a realistic sense that my identity had completely dissolved into the identity of another person who happened to be my father. And in order to do that, I wanted the reader to feel that they didn't know who the I was in that moment. And my editor, when he read that chapter, he said, I don't get it. Is this you or is this your dad? And we had to kind of work through this together so that I could preserve what I had written. But there are a few moments like that where I felt that getting it right was really a matter of pushing at the convention so that I could sneak something else in that I wanted.
Okay, yeah. I mean, you're talking about like pushing some lines there, maybe bits of feeling of tension about what a memoir should do, and it's very significant. The subtitle is A Memoir Against History, and you alluded before to being wary of the reactions of your the essentially Zionist community in Montreal. We can't ignore the fact that the book is coming out now in the middle of the genocide of the Palestinian people by Israel. As an example of the most brutal example possible, really, of where this kind of traditional ethno-national storytelling can get you. Can you tell us a bit about how then it was received when you were in Montreal recently? What kind of pushback, if any, you've had from people, or the kind of arguments that it's led to?
Yeah. So just to be clear, most of you, I assume, have not read the book. It's not only about how I came into possession of these documents, but in following the life of Anna, my great-grandmother, and thinking about this community that she contributed so much to and that educated me, and that now, in the midst of Israel's assault on Gaza, has quite a staunch political position that is so far removed from where I find myself. It really is trying to explore how that came to be and how that might be otherwise in the future. And so, the reaction in some corners was not great. It's very interesting because that community is quite tight knit, but this is also this is the ultimate fruition of the Zionist ideology for the diaspora. I mean, the basic futurity that is implied in Zionism is that one day there will be the great ingathering of all Jews into this land that's been placed in the state that's been placed in Palestine, and the kinds of positions that come with that and the kinds of reaction that come with that are pretty hard-coded. The reaction has been interesting in the sense that I can mostly see that people are reacting out of fear in a way, and it's a fear that I understand deeply, having been educated. I was educated to be Zionist. I went to Jewish day school. I'm not foreign to this place or this kind of ideological enclosure, and the fear comes from a real historical experience or set of historical experiences, but it's also weaponized, right, by the ideology. And one thing that's been, I guess, gratifying has been seeing that even though it's been made clear to me that I'm persona non grata in this community, and that there are a lot of people who believe I've betrayed it or something of that nature. There are a few people who have reached out to me, who I might have known growing up or known of growing up, who have said that they're glad that I've done this, not because I've somehow like put an idea in their head they've never had, but precisely actually the opposite, which is that they themselves had these ideas, but they didn't feel comfortable speaking them, which I think is far too common in strictly guarded discursive environments. So that has been, I guess, the silver lining of all the pushback. which is that there are a couple of people who I feel, in the same way I needed to be given license to begin the book. You know, I think maybe there are a couple of people who feel they've been given license to speak a little differently at the dinner table or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, last week there was this letter published by literary luminaries.
Yeah, Sadie Smith and
yeah,
others. Yeah.
Some of them who hadn't said
Are
much.
people familiar with this? In The Guardian, I think.
I said in the Guardian.
Yeah.
I don't know.
It was like 150.
Big name,
Yeah.
big name writer. It did make headlines, and notable for some of the inclusion of some writers who had either not said anything at all in the, what is it now, 18 months, or had prevaricated quite publicly in various articles. And so the question comes up, and it comes up again and again. You could think of 100 other examples of a similar question, but broadly speaking, I suppose, where do you place what's the place of a writer in this situation when something like this is going on, particularly as with your background and your culture and family history?
Yeah. Well, I guess the conversation tends to revolve around this hobby horse question of whether we can separate the artist from the art, or the author from the work, or something like that. And whether I feel like it somehow tends to gravitate toward whether the art itself needs to be political, and people forget the very idea that the artist or the author, authors are themselves citizens. I mean, they're political beings by their very nature, just by living in society. And I take a lot of inspiration from the French model of doing things, which has not always been successful, but there are some good examples in the history of this country. In mid-century, around the 1950s, when the Nouveau Roman became big here, I mean, this was a group of novelists who were, in their art, absolutely, supposedly quite apolitical. They wanted to kind of revive a high modernist ideal of aesthetic autonomy and art pur, kind of in reaction to Sartrean existentialism and social realism, which had dominated the French novel, especially after the war, when people wanted to demonstrate their moral capital and claiming credentials for having been part of the resistance, as we've talked about before. They wanted this kind of purely, an art that didn't subordinate itself to external discourses. And yet, all of these artists themselves, as not just as private individuals, but as public figures with platforms, as we like to say, were quite political in their day-to-day lives. I mean, you could find almost all of them as signatories on the declaration of, I think it was 121 writers against the Algerian War in the 60s. Robbe-Grillet wrote a letter to then California Governor Ronald Reagan in support of releasing Angela Davis, who had been in prison for support of the Soledad brothers. They were quite committed, and that's because I think they understood that, writer or no, everyone is a citizen, and being a citizen means that you determine what are the affordances of your life, what you do as a profession, but also what you do in your non-professional life. These things have affordances, and they enable you to do certain things as a form of direct action, or whatever your preferred term is. And you are acting as a citizen when you choose to play upon those affordances for the betterment of society or humanity or what have you, or you could use it for ill, of course, as well. And so I think if we maybe just recentered the question away from what is the responsibility of the artist, and just said, well, what is the responsibility of the citizen, of which artists are just a small part, we might have a much better way of talking about what people in general ought to do. And now the thing about writers is that they tend to have a so-called platform. And having a platform means that you can, one of your affordances is the ability to reach lots of people. And so using your voice, not necessarily in your art, but using your voice becomes one of your important capabilities in exercising your citizenship. And so I think it's great they all signed this letter. I mean, it's obviously too little, quite a bit late, but it's better than being silent.
Yeah.
It would have been better if they had done something earlier, but yeah, maybe that's a different conversation.
Maybe something more positive to end. I think we have time for another little excerpt.
Yeah.
So what's the next step then? We go through this book, this memoir, this process of recovering your family's past, looking into how there's lots of stuff we haven't talked about. You should really pick up the book. But there's stuff about the history of Quebec, all kinds of narrative routes that go off and historical interest in there. But where does it leave us? Like what's the, having come through this experience, where are we now? Where do we go?
Well, when I did an event for this book in Montreal a couple weeks ago, and a lot of people who showed up to that event were people who disagreed with the premise of the book, but who came nonetheless knowing what roughly would be in it. And what I said then to a similar kind of question was something like, well, what would be great to do next is just to do more of this. It would be great to sit in rooms and have you even entertain the idea that maybe you don't need Zionism to conceive of a Jewish futurity. But in this environment, being in Paris, not being there, I think I would just say that this is a scalable idea, as the entrepreneurs like to say. You can, I like to think of, say, all of the Jews living in the diaspora. And it's something like 85 to 90% of them refer to themselves, self-identify as Zionist. What I would want ideally is to allow for more conversation in all of these communities, not just in the one I come from, about what it means to conceive of a future as Jewish communities that does not involve Zionism as the be-all end-all ideology. And part of that work, which I try to do a bit in the book, but which I think is really just important for people to do in their lives, is to try to look back historically to the moment before Zionism became the dominant ideology representing the Jews, quote unquote, in exile. The Zionists did a very good job at rounding up or casting a wide net over a massively dispersed global community of Jews who were in fact not one community but thousands. And each of these communities had, especially if you look at some of these very old ones, like in the case of Iran and Iraq and Yemen and the ones in North Africa who had left Spain, they have centuries, if not millennia, of their own customs and traditions, centuries, if not millennia, of living with their neighbors and to a certain degree of peace, of course, never perfect. And they had their own futures as well. I mean, this is something we learn about writing history, is that the past is not only littered with things that happened and artifacts and objects and things we can pick up, but it's also littered with futures that never came to be. Going back and recovering those futures, discovering that there were many non-Zionist, or frankly, if you were talking about a Bundist, anti-Zionist visions of a Jewish future that were held for hundreds of years, especially in the case of it's called pre or non-Zionist views, that can be recuperated. But knowing that they can be recuperated, it's not something that we need to recuperate them all and try to kickstart them again. It's that we need to allow the understanding that other futures are possible, to have us thaw this conviction that it's easier to imagine the end of Jewry than to imagine the end of Zionism. Maybe if we didn't have that conviction, we could think of other ways of being Jewish. So this is kind of my grand idealistic vision of what ought to come to pass.
Are you going to read a little bit more, or we want to move on to some questions?
This bit's pretty short. This is the epilogue to the book, but it doesn't spoil anything. So I'll read it, and then we'll go to Q&A. Having come to the end of something, I still find myself grasping in the dark. At the center of this book, bending the light of my various attempts to regain time past, is a world. I do not mean simply the contained and relatively definable community of Montreal Jews within which I was raised, but rather an ethos that does not belong to any particular geography. It can be found wherever time appears to have ground to a halt, wherever its flow has been dammed in vain by ideology. To Anna and Eugene Stearns, my great-grandparents, this world was the new world, not in the style of the old colonial imagination, but in the style of rebirth and new beginnings that characterizes the refugee imagination. And the moment of their arrival in this new world seems to me antediluvian. In 1938, when they arrived in North America, several alternate futures seemed possible. Looking back to that time, as I write this on an overcast summer's day in 2024, I am aware of the ghosts of those futures that never materialized. Possible configurations of the world, and the Jews living in it, that had not yet been decided. They were futures that belonged to the world of yesterday, brought over by Anna's generation, who always maintained one foot in the new and the other in the old. They were all the various permutations of the what could be that had not yet been foreclosed by a dominant ideology. Concretely, they were the visions of Jewish life that had yet to be captured and assimilated into political Zionism. Pluralistic belonging in North America, for example, or a global secular socialism in which traditional cultures and languages were nurtured as syndicates, as the Bund imagined, or even in a bid to divert the already moving colonial Zionist project toward a more humane direction, if such a thing is possible. Frankly, I don't believe it is. A non-theocratic, multinational, democratic state in Palestine. If the process of writing this book has revealed anything, it is that these vanished visions of the future need to be resuscitated. The cost of failing to do so will be the furtherance of untold misery upon Palestinians and Israelis alike, and the continued stultification of North American Jewry, if not Judaism as such. The world of yesterday was home not only to fledgling Zionists, it was home to thousands of Bund members and supporters who knew that Judaism did not depend on a state for its vitality, to Jews living in Ottoman Palestine, who were, for the most part, non-Zionist, and who were content with their cosmopolitan existence, in the words of Rashid Khalidi, quote, as Jews who were part of the indigenous Muslim majority society, unquote. And to millions of diasporans, who felt that the good fight involved the betterment of life for all, not only themselves, in pluralist and socialist societies that needed to be raised from beneath their feet, not imagined in an elsewhere where others already dwelled. If after the Second World War there was a need for a safe haven for the world's remaining Jews, there was never any need for Zionism. At least not the Zionism that came to pass, that which leveraged the colonial apparatuses of state to take for itself what belonged to others. But the past is past. It is there not to be undone, but to be remembered. And insofar as we forget the futures it dreamed of, we forget to dream of futures for ourselves. Anna's new world, our world of today, the one that made me, and consequently this book, now imagines no future. It sustains itself on an eternal, horizonless present. This is a presentist ideology, the inability to know the past and to see it as having conditioned the current moment, the inability to know the future and to see it as something that can be created, the inability to know the present and to see it as something that is always becoming past, and all of this in an infinite movement of recurrence. If the Holocaust is perpetually yesterday and tomorrow, as my brother once wrote to me, and as I discuss in one of the chapters in this book, then we neither know nor see the past, present, or future, and we are beset on all sides by horror. Who would dare rejoin the flow of time against such odds? But I am indulging in fallacies. There is no rejoining time, just as there is no damming it. You will be born ahead whether you will it or not. The greater your insistence on an ideology of the present, the greater your complicity in the ravages that such ideologies wreak to sustain themselves. You are being born ahead, hour after hour, sentence after sentence. Anna understood this. Quote, the world falls away like wet sand being drawn out into the rip current, she wrote in a letter. Yet she refused to stay standing on the shore. The past was not a foreign country to her. She could return there in an instant through memory, with the ethos of a critic, for she knew that it produced the present in which she lived and contained the mistakes that would rectify in her dreams, that she would rectify in her dreams of the future. We would do well to see in her future our past, and to see in that past the errors we repeat compulsively to bloody ends. The place I come from, the world that was new to Anna but has since lost all novelty, is all seized up. To reanimate it, we must try, as I have vainly done, to recapture that old spirit, sing that old song. to imagine new possibilities for our lives, yes, but also to resurface the old ways of being individuals, being Jews and being citizens, ways that used to obtain in the world of yesterday, and that might yet obtain tomorrow. The next world, our new one, is something we must create daily. We can begin by consigning all that is rotten and wicked to the dustbin.
All right. Anyone have a question for Ben?
Don't be shy.
We have one in the back.
Hey Ben.
Hey Chris.
Thank you for this. This is such a wonderful event.
Thanks.
It's cool to see you here. Obviously, we're sitting here in this sort of strange Anglophone context in Paris. And of course, the sort of simultaneous uneasy presence of English and French is one of the constituent features of the dividing line to which your title adds an augmentation. And yet, of course, the archive that instantiated this project was, as you alluded to, German. And of course, your conversations with, with your relatives were ostensibly mediated through this third language, so to speak. I'm wondering, both sort of from a kind of processual standpoint, how you went through the process of translating that archive, and then on a kind of higher level, to what extent you're thinking about the possibly false, or maybe on the other hand, ideal promises of translation as a concept informed your thinking about, as you put it, the kind of impossibility of access to the black hole of the other, so to speak. Is there a way that the translation can, despite all of its sort of necessary failures, make some effort at bridging that kind of subjective divide?
It's such a good question. Well, I guess like translation has this, in the same way that writing a form of history has, requires you or asks you to adopt this pretense that there is a transcendent set of facts that you can, if you're good, string together and bring before the reader. Translation also has this kind of the sense of the meta language, or the the capital T, capital L, true language that somehow mediates between the language of origin and the one into which you're translating, that you can gain access to if your translation is good or pure enough. But I guess it was Walter Benjamin who first wrote about this, and it's since kind of, I guess, the law in translation studies that if there is such a thing, it exists as this kind of untouchable noumena that we'll never be able to access, and that language is simply what we do with it and how it iterates through our speaking it. In this project, I felt that, so to answer the first part of your question, there were so many languages. There was Russian, it was English, French, German, Russian, Polish, Yiddish, and some other stuff, like Czech and stuff. My great-grandmother spoke a lot of languages, and English and French I can do fine. German I can do slowly, and the rest I can't do at all. And so I focused on what I could do, and I did a bit here and there trying to use translation tools to help me, but a huge part of this archive remains untranslated, and I'm still completely ignorant of, and isn't in this book at all. And that's something important to say, is that this book is non-exhaustive of what I was working with, not in the slightest. But what I found most enjoyable but also illuminating was that when Anna would write letters in English, and this was like her sixth language, she would write it in this kind of just imperfect way. And she was very smart, but she, like anyone doing a sixth language, such a thing is conceivable in this room, certainly not to me. It was just imperfect enough that you get caught on these errors in syntax and grammar, or just a strange way of phrasing something, a very German way of phrasing something. And those moments are what brought me closest to her, what really made me feel that actually her failure at doing a perfect translation was producing for me a textured surface that suddenly I felt I could grip onto and gave me a bit of contact and gave me a sense that actually I do have something to write about here. I do have something to say about this phantom, as I put it earlier.
So you said that you moved here 3 years ago?
Yeah.
What's it like being a Canadian writer in Paris?
It's not like being a Canadian writer in Canada, I guess. But, well, you know, especially in Montreal, right? 'Cause Paris has, just like Montreal, extremely siloed linguistic literary scenes. I mean, you don't often see in Montreal, at a Montreal book reading like this, that's mostly in English, you don't often see Francophone writers, Francophone editors, publishers come, and I think, and vice versa. And I think the same is kind of true here. I mean, Toby has lived here for a while, and Toby is the editor of Minor Literatures, which is a great publication, and we've done a few events here, and we've yet to bridge the divide, say. So it feels very similar in that sense, specifically to Montreal, maybe. But it is interesting living in a place where reading is a much more regular and kind of respected activity. People here just read more, and I think it's kind of a given that if you're going to be a person in the world, you should have read something. And I guess the education system here really pushes that. So that's been interesting, is having literary conversations here. I feel often they feel a lot more like some of the graduate seminars that I would have attended in the United States, whereas often in Canada, when I'm speaking to writers, there's a divide between the writers who very clearly read and the writers who don't read that much. And I wouldn't even say the divide, it is funny, but the divide isn't always qualitative. Like, I think there are great writers who don't read that much. I don't know how, but they do exist. So maybe that's a bit of a difference, too. Yeah.
You mentioned that you were ambivalent about calling it a memoir. Do you want to speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, so if you do read this book, which I highly recommend, by the way, in fact, I hear they might be for sale after this event, you will see that it's really not about me so much. That second chapter where I describe getting the documents is about me, and I pop up here and there, but it's really more about other people, and it's about places, and there's a whole chapter where I do like a kind of a big essay on Canadian history, and it reads a bit more like a typical historical essay in a way. So the generic variety in this book was partly why I felt so resistant. I just wanted to call it The Third Solitude without a subtitle. And my approach to writing it, I think a lot of nonfiction books proceed from the principle that you have a kind of emotional or psychological core that you begin from, and then each of your chapters is kind of an emanation from that core. But for me, it was more like I knew where I wanted to end up, and what I would do is kind of like stalk the perimeters and see that there were like an infinity of entrances I could take and kind of poke my head in, and when one looked good, I would just dive in. And each entrance sort of demanded its own generic expression, but it led me to that same core, and I think that's where the book is unified, but it's not really unified at a generic level. And if it was going to be a memoir, I insisted that it be a memoir against history, because something I do a lot in the book is I do kind of militate against, or at least really resist, the temptations that are typical to writing history, which is to overlay the categories that we have, that we're given, that one wants to overlay as a way of creating a neat narrative onto the parts of the past that I happen to be exploring. So it's against in that sense, but it's also against in the sense that that resistance is a failure in the book. I don't really achieve it, and so I have to lean against those conventions at the end of the day, and it has, I think, this kind of dual meaning.
That was my question.
Okay. Tim.
I've read Ben's book, it's really good.
Thank you, Tim.
Are you going to go back in for more? Like, the archive hasn't been exhausted.
I might, yeah, but not anytime soon, I think. I feel, I think a lot of writers feel that the projects they begin on are kind of like these elaborate like exorcisms.
Yeah.
And sometimes you can exorcise the demon in a short story, and sometimes it takes a book, and sometimes it takes a lifetime. And I feel like I exorcised it with this book. What happened was I wrote that really shitty novel that I mentioned that's never going to come out. And after doing that, I realized, okay, this wasn't it. This didn't do the thing that I needed to do. And after doing this, I felt that actually maybe I could let this archive sleep for a bit, and either I'll come back to it or someone else will, or maybe no one will.
Has writing it changed your feeling on how many solitudes you exist within it?
Yeah, I don't think there are just 3. This is a spoiler. Well, I think these solitudes are kind of, as I said, this structural feature of society, and it can be useful to think about central and peripheral aspects of society, or dominant and dominated aspects. I mean, these as like hermeneutic devices can help us understand certain things, but they also, I found in the case of thinking about the Third Solitude, it could reinforce a failure to recognize the fact that many other peoples have since come into Canada as immigrants, and have stepped into a position that's kind of analogous to the one that the Jews found themselves in at around mid-century, and that they are as varied and variegated as the people on Earth, and that maybe there's a fault in this categorization at a certain level of understanding.
All right.
Anyone else? Yeah, Max?
So I found myself living in Montreal for maybe like my first year, right when the assaults on Gaza began, and I found that at protests and demonstrations that the presence of First Nations communities and Indigenous communities were they were huge, and there was a big link between the Palestinian liberation and this kind of liberation. I'm wondering if this is part of the book, this is part of your relationship to about Montreal and about
Canada. It was definitely a very good question, and it was very much on my mind. And it is, I mean, there's an interesting confluence around like the indigeneity discourse, but that also gets weaponized and disfigured from a Zionist perspective too. I mean, it's really fascinating how many uses and abuses indigeneity can be subjected to. But I was thinking about it, and in the 5th chapter I talk about how Canada was kind of carved up first by the French and then by the English Empire, or the British Empires. And in the process of this carving up, this interesting thing happens. Anyone who's lived in Quebec or has paid attention to Quebec would be familiar with, which is that there's a contingent of French-Canadian nationalists who style themselves as indigenous to Quebec. It's fascinating, and you can see this in like political federal election debates where 2 federal elections ago, the head of the Bloc Québécois, which is like the party representing Quebec interests at the national level, the leader of that party was asked about what he would do as prime minister to redress all of the harms done to Indigenous peoples in Canada, and he began his answer by saying, well, as a member of a First Nation, and this was a white guy who came from many generations of French settlers, but I talk about how in the case of Quebec, and then obviously analogously in the case of Israel, a victimhood status can develop that is what I was calling like a primary victimhood status, which is to say that there's a sense not only that victimization occurred. In the case of the French, the idea was that the English colonists came and made life terrible for them. They won't admit that they just lost the game of colonialism there. But this victimization occurs in the narrative. But key to that is that somehow this victimization needs to be redressed before another victim can be considered, especially before the victim of that erstwhile victim could be considered as a victim as such. And this was something that helped me think in parallel between the case of Quebec and the case of Israel-Palestine, while obviously those two things are extremely different in many other ways. Yes?
Yeah. You talked about how back home for you, a lot of family members and friends weren't thrilled about what you were writing. I was just kind of curious if you could go in that a little more, like how that's been, how you're feeling with this coming out, and how you think that's going to go in the future with friends and family.
Yeah, well, I won't get into any specifics just to preserve some people's privacy, but I do. In the book, I actually reproduce an email I wrote to a cousin of mine who is quite a staunch Zionist and was very upset with some of the positions I had, and who was writing to me constantly in the days after October 7th. And I wrote a long email to her back explaining why I hold the positions I hold, that she never responded to. She said she would, but she didn't. I felt that in putting that letter in there, I was giving myself the room to say that I didn't, to the degree that I had to not abandon the people in the place that raised me, frankly, that educated me, that nurtured me. This was the extent of my duty, which was giving them the respect of calmly and I think quite gently explaining why I think what I think, even as internally I very violently oppose what they feel. And so in that way, I feel that demon, so to speak, has been exercised. I know that there are people back home who don't they don't want to associate with me anymore. They don't like me anymore. But that's kind of okay. I wasn't really associating with them anymore anyway. It was more of a sense of we're going to sort of come out of the woodwork to oppose this, but it didn't change what for me was fundamentally home in my heart, which is my, primarily my family and some friends that I've kept over the years. Yeah. Thanks.
I think that's it. That's good. All right. Thank you very much to Penelope and to the Red Wheelbarrow for
Yes,
this.
thank you.
Get a copy of the book.
And thank you all for coming out. Really appreciate it.
Hello, we have more booze.
Hey.
I'd like to take the drinks outside and the cups, and I'll give you the bottles.
Great.
And can everybody buy their copy of the book next door? And then you guys will sign either outside or inside.
Wherever people want, I'll sign.
Can you pass